JD, would you mind leading us in a word of prayer, please?
Our Father in heaven, come before you now, study from your word, learn more about you and how we should live and conduct ourselves, help our studies to be productive this evening, that we may apply against these read, especially partake in, that we can apply to our lives, be better followers. Pray for those who may still be traveling here, for safe passage for them, that we may all study together and learn to grow this evening. Lord, Son's name we pray.
Amen. And okay, like I said, we didn't get as far as I wanted to last week in the book. So hopefully we'll move a little bit faster tonight. Just kind of to go through what we discussed last week. We talked about James, the writer here. What we determined that pretty much this James is the Lord's half brother that's writing this book, and he states that that he's a bondservant of God and with the Lord Jesus Christ to the 12 tribes, which are scattered abroad, and we look at this in the sense that it's probably a figure of speech that James is using here, because we know that the 12 tribes are no longer here. They're no longer valid here. So we think that he's writing this letter to the Christians throughout Asia Minor and they're around the the Mediterranean. So we believe that he's writing, this letter to all the Christians that are spread out there. And we know that he's not writing this letter to us, right? This letter is to those brethren that are spread out here. So these are the ones that he's writing to, and the brethren that he's writing to here are going through some really tough times, hard times. And but what he talks about in verses 2 through 4, not that the faithful are not exempt from being, going through trials. And I always think about Brother Steve's study on the book of Revelation and what the book of Revelation talks about. And it starts out by talking about, but those who have an ear, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And what it was leading into is that these brethren was going to suffer some real persecution. They were going to go through some real trials and tribulation. And so, Satan started, tempting God's people. Where can we remember he first started his attack on God's family? Or Garden of Eden. So it would be pretty naive to think that he somehow, has taken off and no longer on the attack of Christians. And that's why I say I think about, when I was thinking about, this study here, in that, in the book of Revelation, where it talks about is Satan going after God's people. And it's no different, I think, with these Christians here that James is writing to, is that, these trials that they're going through is Satan's attack on them. And James knows that, that they are going to have to be able to face these hardships, and their response to these hardships is what really matters, because there's always going to be persecution and trial for God's people, and even in the King James Version, it uses the word temptation instead of trial. But the term is actually broad in scope, in that it includes all kind of hardship. And so not just temptation to sin, but the important thing to remember is not to allow the trials to become temptations. And so James is concerned, for his readers that, not whether they will suffer because they certainly will, but his concern is about, how they respond to this suffering. And so he says how does he say to respond to these trials in the appropriate manner? How does he say to respond to them?
Consider it joy.
Okay. Yeah. Respond to them with joy. And joy meaning what? To consider or look at these trials as an opportunity for joy. And to know that joy and faith is connected here, as he stated in verses 1 and 3. Because we know that even though these temptations and these trials will come about, but what they do know is that in God's hand, any experience that they have has the potential of what? Turning into good, right? Any type of trials or temptation they have is in God's hand is possible for good, and so that's what he states in verse 3. And he says the testing of your faith, he says, produces patience. And what does he mean by patience? Endurance. Okay. What else? Long suffering, steadfastness, right? Refuse to give up. And here is the refusal to stop trusting in God and in his goodness, which bring us to this spiritual wholeness. And so we'll go to James 1, 5 through 8 tonight. We'll start at James 1, 5 through 8, and we're talking about seeking wisdom. And I won't read through this. We read through it last week, chapter 1. But in verses 5 through 8, he talks about the proper attitude, the appropriate. This book of James could be, could be a subtitle. Wisdom of living. Wisdom of Christian living. Okay, go ahead, James.
I was going to hit back on joy. So
okay.
I think sometimes if we just read through it, we're like, we have to be happy when we endure trials. I don't think that's what it's saying. When you consider it a great joy whenever you are tried and you you're testing your endurance to see how far you can limit or how far you can go before you sin against God. I would say that you're considering it a joy because when you're going through your trials, you also know what you're getting at the end. I think this joy goes down to verse 12 where it says, "Blessed is the one who endures trials, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him." That joy is knowing that if I sustain through these trials, if I endure these trials, I have that hope of the of a crown of life with Jesus in heaven.
Okay. So does it seem like it's automatic to obtain this joy?
Well, if you're a Christian, you have joy of eternal life. It's just the Christian life is not going to be easy.
Okay.
It's not always going to be the most joyful of lives when we see others living in sin that we are trying to abstain from. But we know that our joy is not in the material life. It's not in the things we own, the things that we can get. It's not that quote unquote happiness. It's the hope of eternal salvation that we have as Christians.
Okay. All right. I think Janet had Janet had a hand up first. Wendy. Okay.
I would say no, it's not automatic because it's a process. When you're a young Christian, there are some things that you have to go through, and you have to pass the test, so to speak, and you build on that. And as you mature in your Christian walk, you will see that some of the things that you desire, some of the things or the obstacles that, some of the issues that you thought were obstacles when you were a younger Christian, they aren't obstacles anymore. So I would say that, well, at least for me, it wasn't automatic.
Okay. Yeah, and what does James say about testing? The test is the testing of your faith.
Building that endurance.
You know, that build, you know, that produces patience. Wendy?
I was just going to say, even for me, I've been a Christian a long time now. I find that I allow things to steal my joy.
Okay.
And that joy is constant from God. He doesn't waver. He is steadfast. But I think for me, I lose sight of it. I allow the chaos of the world, the busyness, the trials, you know, even things that aren't trials, just kind of cloud what my ultimate goal is. And I think that happens to a lot of Christians, especially mothers, you know, who are multitasking through the day. We just lose sight. And we should be joyful because we have salvation,
Okay.
or hope of salvation.
Yeah, and look at the Christians that he's writing to, right? I mean, are these Christians kind of a young, or you know, to the faith, to Christianity? He wrote this book in about 49 A.D. And when was the church established? When was the church founded? Okay.
33 AD.
So 33 AD to about 40 something AD.
But you don't have people who are born and raised in the church like we have today.
Generations to look up to.
These are young, I mean, you know, really young in the faith, Christians. And the thing that, you know, that I try, I mean, you know, that I've looked at is that, you know, like I said, with Satan being on the attack, Satan knows our Achilles heel, doesn't he? He knows our weakness. So what is he going to do, you know what I mean, when he come after these Christians? He hit them in their weak spot. And that's where, you know, I think James is trying to, you know, wake them up to these things are going to happen. But, you know, so get ready for it and, you know, understand that it's the testing of your faith here. But you got to remain steadfast. You got to continue to trust in God. Don't give up. Because you know where your safety net is.
I was just gonna say, praying for wisdom is like asking to be like Christ.
Okay. And so we'll move on to that then. We move on to what it's talking about, and we're talking about wisdom. And the approach subtitle, as I said, for the letter of James might be the wisdom of living. And the first thing into gaining wisdom is to realize where it does and where it does not come from. And wisdom does not come from information or education or even experience. It may, these may be tools to gain wisdom, but where does he say wisdom come from?
It's divine.
From God. That's right. The wisdom that he's talking about it comes from God. And James says that true wisdom comes as a gift to God's people. And he described God as giving liberally, or a sense of generously. And God doesn't scold us. He doesn't scold them for asking. Rather, he invites us to ask for wisdom, doesn't he? And he promised to do what? He promised to give it. And so the condition of receiving wisdom, though, is conditioned for receiving wisdom is faith. And in verses 6 through 8, he says doubters. He talks about doubters. James says, what about doubters? Those who doubt? Unstable. Okay. I think the word here, double-minded. Talks about it's double-minded. And one is looking in two directions. And, it's important to note, though, that James is not criticizing the smallness of one's faith, because none of us pray with the faith we should have. Do we? We have a helper, don't we? We have a helper. As stated in Romans 8, verse 26. It said the Spirit helps us in our prayers. So, he's not criticizing for someone for the smallness of faith. James?
This is an aside, but I wonder if those in the first century told stories about each other like the way we do. Like we tell stories about Brother Don Blackwell all the time. I wonder if James, by proximity, may have heard the story about Peter walking on the water here from Jesus, or from somebody else in the early church, and how Peter took his eyes off of Jesus, lost his faith in Jesus' ability to put him on the water, that he then began to sink, because he's using kind of the same imagery. Peter became a double-minded person, questioning whether Jesus could keep him on the waters. Something I think about when I read this is wonder if he heard stories about Peter walking on the water.
Don't know. Yeah, very well could have happened. Well, the thing, here, what he's talking about, he doesn't condemn one, the divided mind, condemn one for the smallness of faith. What he's condemning is, when one cannot either, decide for or against God. And that, that have no anchor of the soul, and it's an unswerving loyalty to the Lord. But God never refuses to give wisdom to His children, with who love Him and seek Him, and we should never hesitate to ask God for wisdom. And verses 9 through 18 talks about this specific need for wisdom. And so James now applies the need for wisdom to some of the major spiritual issues of life: wealth, temptation, and the source of goodness. And so in regard to wealth, we need wisdom in order to recognize its relative importance. And so everything around us tells us that money is the most important thing, to us. But in response to this idea, James says in verses 9 and 10 something that sounds backwards, doesn't he? But which is exactly right. He says, "For the lowly, the poor brother, the poor people should boast of their exaltation, and the rich should boast of their humiliation." All right? And so what does James mean by these words?
You should realize
James?
that Monday.
I'm sorry, but James had his hand up. Go ahead, Sister Eva. Go ahead.
They must realize, both must realize, that wealth means nothing, position and status means nothing to God.
Okay. All right. What else?
I think he's going back to the Beatitudes: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So those who are of humble circumstances, who are poor, recognize their need for God and for His sustaining them, that they come to Him in faith, looking forward to the kingdom of heaven.
Okay. So, Janet.
Just to piggyback on what we said, when I think of a lowly brother, it's like when you have become a Christian, you have exalted yourself, in this world where riches are king. But when you become a Christian, you've automatically exalted yourself. And for the rich, it's showing that your riches are nothing compared to God. God gives everything.
Right. When one considers, what you have in Christ, poor, don't mean anything to you, does it? I mean, as a Christian, if you're in Christ, if you have Christ, poor, is, you should boast. I mean, you should really be joyful about where you are as a Christian. I think about it all the time. If you look at, the people around you, and your neighbor, your friends, even family, that have no interest in God, that are not in Christ, that are and you understand, how much you have in Christ, that you're not like that anymore. Don't we? I mean, we should consider that, shouldn't we? I mean, if, like I said, you got people who say they're religious and whatnot, but, if you understand the word, the gospel, you understand that they're not in Christ, but they think they are, and it's a sad situation, to think of people who think they're in Christ and are not. And you consider yourself, I know I'm in Christ. I've obeyed the gospel. committed to obedience to the gospel. James?
I was going to say further, it's important to know that our economic status doesn't play a role into our salvation. Because one can be,
Say what again? I'm sorry.
our economic status doesn't play a role into our
Absolutely.
salvation. We can be either poor or we can even be rich
Okay.
and have salvation. But I think the problem comes, as I was reading from about the rich young ruler today, the rich young ruler allowed his riches to gain preeminence over following Jesus. He was willing to lay aside his riches to follow Christ. And I think that also the attitude of the rich person, if he's not willing to lay aside his riches to follow Christ,
Okay.
bring low.
Yeah, but I mean, right. So, I mean, is there anything wrong with being rich? Eric?
I think so back to the love of money being the root of all evil. So it's not necessarily being rich or being poor, because a poor person can suffer the same attitude, loving money, just not having enough. And going back to Ecclesiastes 5:10, it says, "He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase is also vanity."
Okay. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. So, wisdom, well, godly wisdom, well, you know, like I said, the rich person should, you know, should be humble because of, you know, being in Christ, and he realized, you know, how his riches, you know, how relatively unimportant they are, and how they will, what James said will happen, you know, with the riches and the rich person. They will all fade away. It will all fade away. So godly wisdom likewise help us to understand temptation properly. And although he says that people may say in verse 14 says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. Alright? So, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. And so, you know, one may say, you know, I mean, they may not say it, but who does it sound like he's saying, you know, they blame for them being tempted? They're, you know, a person, you know,
Some say the devil made me do it.
yeah. Well, who does, you know, they usually wind up blaming for being tempted and drawn away? God. Right? But James, what he said, James will have nothing of this. He says that a person is tempted. He said, no one say when he is tempted. When he is tempted, I'm tempted of God. But God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. So what does he say temptation come from? Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desires has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So, what he's saying is, you know, when one is tempted, he cannot blame God. Because God cannot be tempted by sin or evil. One is drawn away by his own desire. And when that desire has conceived and you know, have master control over him, the person, what happens? When sin, yeah, It brings forth death. What he
Separation
says.
from God.
Excuse me?
Separation from God.
Separation from God. Yeah. So it brings forth death. When sin is full, you know, the one's being tempted and, you know, and he gives in and sin, you know, becomes full grown, you know, gaining master over him, it brings forth death. And so, finally, just as wisdom leads us to recognize the true source of temptation, it also leads us to understand the true source of goodness. And rather than saying that, God is, you know, our divine tempter, James described God as the giver of every good gift and every perfect gift. And he never changes, and the wise person will always keep that truth in mind, according to James 18. It says, his own will he's brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruit of his creatures. And so, I got about 5 more minutes. So, just as a question, how might a misunderstanding of James actually keep a person from praying? James 1, 6-8. Where he talks about let him who asks in faith with no doubting, for he who doubt is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wave, for let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So how that might be misunderstood and actually keeping a person from praying.
Well, they might have some doubt.
Okay. All right.
Well, we haven't gotten there, but from James 4, it talks about them asking amiss because they're asking for selfish things.
Okay.
Just like when it talks about the sins, we sin because we go after our own desires. If we're going after God's desires, what He desires for us, we wouldn't be sinning.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Else might, you know, that one gain a misunderstanding about James 6:1, 6-8. Okay. What are some possible reasons what are some possible reasons that a person might say, I am tempted by God? What are some possible reasons that a person might say, I am tempted by God?
Some people would say, well, God made me like this, and so if I wasn't made like this, I wouldn't have these urges.
He's allowing Satan to tempt him. He's giving Satan authority to do such. So in a way, he's causing him to be tempted.
Because he gives power to Satan to do certain things, and that's the reason for saying that God tempted me, because Satan has these powers or something. Wendy. Oh. Anyone else? Yeah, I mean, those are all good things, you know, to say, you know, to blame God for being tempted. And, you know, like I say, you know, one might even, you know, consider, you know, I don't have certain things, you know, because, you know, God has, you know, hasn't blessed me. You know, He hasn't blessed me like He has other people. Yeah, that's why I don't have certain things. But we should always consider that, you know, whether we have or we don't, you know, we're blessed regardless. Okay.
I think a lot of what he's talking about too comes down to contentment.
Okay.
Are we content in God's promises, His steadfastness, and what He has offered us and we have accepted the day we obey the gospel? Or are we looking outside of God? And that's when we sin, fall into temptation, get tempted, because we're just not content. We're not content with whatever it may be in our life.
Yeah.
And
Is that wrong?
contentment breeds rebellion. And anything outside of God is rebellion.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's our own desires. You know, we desire to have this, that, and the other. You know, people some have said, you know, being about having things, you know, being like the Joneses. You know, and that happened with a lot of people. You know, they want to be like their rich neighbor, or you know, or somebody to have all these niceties.
I think it's human nature to take the credit and not the blame. So
Okay.
they don't want to blame themselves for falling short. So, but if something goes good, they want to take the credit for it, but they don't want to take the blame. So they blame anyone, anything, and God happens to fall into that.
Yeah. Talking to a guy over here in Johnson the other day, you know, and he was telling me about how he works for some what did he say? What company that was? It was some kind of company he works for, and he travels all over the place. And he said, you know, he learned a valuable lesson. That what he has, he paid for it out of his own money. He worked. He makes good money traveling around. He has to leave his family, but he makes a lot of money that way. And he said he puts away all his, as much of his money as he possibly can. And he said, you know, the things that he buy out of his money. He don't get nothing on credit. He said because he don't want no one to come and take anything from him. That, you know, if they take it, you know, they steal it from him. But he paid for. He said he wanted to pay for everything. I said that's a great idea. You know, a great mindset of being able to, you know, living that way. Because a lot of us, and I included myself, you know, I said, you know, yeah, we tend to live outside our means, and that's what gets us in trouble. And once that happens, you know, first thing we want to say, somehow, it was God's fault that I, you know, lost my job and I can't pay my bills no more or do whatever. It somehow, you know, it's put off on God. But it's not God's fault. You know, if we as Christians live like God wants to live, we're going to live within our means. He tells you to pay your bills. You know, really, we shouldn't be getting things on credit and all of this kind of stuff. That's the worldly ways. You know, that we should live in a way that we shouldn't have to, you know, be worried about people coming to take our belongings. But we do, you know, but how do we handle when that happens? You know, that's the main thing to remember, you know, is how you handle it. You know, if they come and take your house and your car, you know, because you're over healed in debt. Whose fault is that? We certainly can't blame God for that, can we? He didn't give it to us. You know, yeah, we might say, yeah, that was a blessing, you know, God, that I got this house or whatever. I prayed for it and I asked for it and I got it and I can't pay for it, but it's not God's fault that we lose it. Okay. Why do you think that James does not mention Satan in verses 14 and 15 when he talks about temptation? But he's the one that's tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when these desires has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. What do you think of it, James?
Because it's not Satan's fault either.
Not Satan's fault either, is it? Right?
Satan may put the stumbling block there, but it's our own choice to fall on that block.
Exactly right. Not Satan's fault either. Oh yeah, I mean, you know, we don't have to deal with it because, you know, we get ourselves in predicaments that, you know, we can't get out of. But it's not Satan's fault either. Good point. So anybody else?
Well, he answers his own question because he says it's your own evil desire.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you know, there are people that say Satan made me do it. They're laying blame too, where it doesn't lie, as even just as you're saying, God made me, tempted me. But anyone that is blaming God just shows a lack of knowledge of the scriptures.
Okay. Yeah. But do we have a lack of knowledge though? If, you know, like I said, we get caught up in these things and, you know, and we first, I mean, we start blaming. Because we start blaming somebody, don't we? Or do we always take responsibility, say, you know, well, that was...
In weak times, when weakness overcomes.
I know I was upset when I lost my job. You know, I didn't consider that as joy. You know but which I should have. You know, consider that as an opportunity to put more faith in God. Now, stop putting my trust in myself, my abilities, and in the world of flashy things, and put more, you know, more trust in God now.
I think many times we put ourselves in a situation and where we are unduly tempted, but it's our own fault, and then we want to blame someone else because humans would rather blame somebody.
Human nature, isn't it? We gotta blame somebody.
I'm going to blame you, I'm going to blame the government, I'm going to blame anybody I can, but I'm not going to blame myself.
Right?
And we do it to ourselves by the way we live our lives.
That's
If
right.
we live a simple, pure life, those things would not happen.
Right. James?
In the Garden of Eden, Satan, all he had to do was say, did God really say you couldn't eat of this tree? Surely when you eat this tree, you'll become like God. That's why he doesn't want you to eat of it. But it doesn't say that Satan reached up, took the fruit, shoved it in Eve's mouth. No, it says Eve, well, when she thought about it, she saw that it was good for food. She took of it, ate it, and gave it to her husband. And then even when God came and questioned Adam, it wasn't, oh, that serpent over there told us to eat it. I was like, Lord, you gave me this woman, and she gave it to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're putting the blame on each other, not even on Satan, because it was her action that took it off, and it was his action that took it from her, but it's his mouth as well.
All right.
When they plant the seed.
God's wisdom goes beyond common sense, because common sense wouldn't tell us to have joy whenever we have trials. But His wisdom begins in a respect for Him and to do His will.
Yeah.
And look beyond. You have to look beyond the present trial.
Okay. Yeah, because
The
what?
results of perseverance.
Right, because what does James say that wisdom teaches us?
Long suffering, perseverance.
Understand, right, the source of temptation. You know, understand where these things come from. You know, they don't come out of the blue from nowhere. You know, understand where they come from, and to understand the source of goodness. Where where the good and perfect gifts come from? From God. That's right, from God. Okay. Any more questions, comments? Because I think we're out of time, right? 7:15 we quit.